Elara Thorne stared at the heavy iron bolt on her wardrobe door, the realization hitting her harder than any physical blow. Her sisters had locked it from the outside, and the key was nowhere to be found. Elara's breath hitched, the silence of her bedchamber suddenly amplified by the distant, rhythmic clip-clop of horses arriving at the estate gates. Tonight was the royal ball, the only night in a decade that King Alaric would step down from his throne to choose a companion among the nobility. Cordelia and Octavia had spent months ensuring Elara would be nowhere near that ballroom, and seeing the empty space where her gown should have been was their final, calculated cruelty. She wasn't just being left behind, she was being erased. But as she stood before the locked wood, trembling in a plain, threadbare shift, a strange, defiant spark ignited in her chest. She had spent years sewing the most intricate, breathtaking gowns for her sisters to wear, masking her own brilliance to keep the peace. If they wanted a servant, they would have one, but if they wanted to keep her from the king's sight, they had drastically underestimated her ability to stitch a path through the impossible. The morning sun bled through the narrow window of the attic room, illuminating dust motes that danced around Elara Thorne's hunched shoulders. She sat on the floor, her fingers moving with a rhythmic, silent precision as she repaired the hem of Cordelia's gold-threaded silk gown. The gown was a masterpiece of her own creation, yet it would be worn by a woman who refused to acknowledge the calluses on Elara's palms. Down the hall, the sound of muffled laughter and the clinking of jewelry chests marked the start of another day of performative vanity. Cordelia and Octavia were already deep into the preparations for the royal ball, treating the upcoming event as a battlefield where Elara was the only casualty. Life in the Thorne estate was an exercise in erasure. Elara's father, burdened by the ghosts of his dwindling fortune and a stack of mounting debts, simply looked past her, as if her presence were a smudge on a ledger he no longer wished to read. Her sisters, however, saw her clearly enough to fear her. They knew that while they possessed the status, Elara possessed the talent. She was the one who sketched the patterns, mixed the dyes, and embroidered the bodices that made them the talk of the season. A sharp, demanding knock echoed against her door, and before she could tuck her own sewing away, Octavia swept into the room without invitation. She held a pair of ruined, stained gloves toward Elara with a sneer of performative annoyance. "These need mending before sunset," Octavia commanded, her eyes skimming the small, cramped space with undisguised disdain. "And do not bother with your own wardrobe today, Elara. We have enough to worry about without being seen with a girl who looks as though she dressed in the dark." Elara took the gloves, her expression carefully neutral, though the weight of the injustice burned behind her ribs. Once the door clicked shut, she reached under the loose floorboard beneath her bed. Her hand brushed against a bundle of midnight blue velvet, the secret gown she had been constructing in the dead of night for months. It was simple, elegant, and devoid of the garish excess her sisters favored. It was a garment for a woman who wanted to be seen, not for the sake of a title, but for the sake of her own truth. She knew the risks of keeping it, and she knew the venomous jealousy it would ignite if discovered. Yet, as she began the intricate beadwork on the bodice, Elara felt a pulse of defiance. If they intended to keep her a servant, she would play the part perfectly during the day, but beneath the candlelight of the royal ballroom, she would finally be the architect of her own fate. The ball was not just an opportunity for her sisters, it was the stage where she would finally emerge from the shadows they had built around her. The news of the Royal Proclamation rippled through the kingdom like a fever, transforming every village market and noble drawing room into a frantic theater of ambition. King Alaric was to hold a grand ball, an event intended not merely for pageantry, but for the selection of a consort. For weeks, the atmosphere in the capital was thick with a desperate, metallic tension, as if the very air were charged with the static of thousands of hopeful souls reaching for a crown. Merchants peddled silks imported from across the sea, and etiquette masters worked their pupils until their backs ached, all in preparation for the single night that promised to alter the trajectory of a life forever. Within the Thorne estate, the proclamation had acted like a catalyst, sharpening the cruelty of Cordelia and Octavia until it cut like a blade. They spoke of the king as if he were a prize to be hunted, dissecting his preferences, his rumored moods, and the specific shade of eyes he was said to admire. To them, the king was not a man, but a gilded key to the escape they so frantically craved from their father's crumbling legacy. They practiced their curtsies in the hallway, their laughter brittle and sharp, while Elara watched from the shadows, her own hands stained with the ink and thread of their endless demands. She understood the stakes, as well as they did, though for entirely different reasons. The kingdom was watching, waiting to see who would be chosen, and the weight of that observation made the walls of her home feel as though they were slowly closing in. The king, meanwhile, remained a figure of distant, brooding mystery. Rumors drifted through the servants' quarters that he was weary of the hollow adulation of the court, a man exhausted by the rehearsed smiles and practiced blushes of the nobility. He was, according to the whispers, a sovereign who looked for truth in a room full of mirrors. Elara found a strange comfort in these stories, imagining a man who could see past the silk and the status to the effort beneath the surface. Yet, every time she dared to dream of such a recognition, her sisters' harsh voices would cut through her thoughts, reminding her that in their world, girls like her were meant to be the backdrop, never the centerpiece. As the day of the ball drew closer, the stakes grew impossibly high. For Cordelia and Octavia, the night was about acquisition, but for Elara, it was about the dangerous, fragile possibility of finally being seen as someone worthy of a life beyond the reach of their cruelty. The iron gates of the palace loomed like the bars of a gilded cage, towering over the line of carriages that stretched toward the horizon. Elara sat tucked into the corner of the family carriage, her hands hidden deep within the folds of a simple, dark shawl that obscured the midnight blue velvet gown she had managed to finish in the silence of her attic. Beside her, Cordelia and Octavia were radiant, their silhouettes sharp with ambition and armored in the finest silks Elara had spent weeks stitching to perfection. Every time the carriage jolted, they smoothed their skirts with manicured fingers, their eyes bright with the predatory hunger of women who believed the night was already theirs to conquer. Elara remained still, her breath shallow, feeling as though she were a ghost haunting her own life, desperately hoping to vanish into the shadows before anyone realized she was there. When they finally arrived, the palace entrance was a blinding cascade of light and sound that nearly brought Elara to her knees. As they stepped out onto the marble threshold, the sheer scale of the opulence threatened to swallow her whole. The air smelled of expensive perfume, wax candles, and cold, polished stone, and the nobles who moved through the grand hall seemed to glide like figures in a dream, their jewels catching the chandeliers until it felt as though the stars themselves had been brought down to earth. Elara felt profoundly small, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird as she followed her sisters into the heart of the ballroom. The transition from the dusty solitude of her attic to this roaring sea of gold and silk was jarring. Every laugh sounded like a judgment, and every glance cast in her direction felt like a blade, stripping away the thin layer of confidence she had desperately tried to cultivate. She clung to the edge of the room, near the gilded pillars, watching as the nobility performed the intricate dance of social maneuvering. Cordelia and Octavia were already adrift in the center of the room, their movements rehearsed and their smiles sharp, perfectly at home in the artificial brightness that Elara found so suffocating. She realized then that she was an interloper, a stain on the perfection of the evening, and the crushing weight of her own invisibility became both a shield and a source of deep, aching loneliness. She tucked her chin down, focusing on the intricate patterns of the floor tiles, praying that the king's gaze would pass over her just as everyone else's had, never suspecting that the very thing she feared most, being noticed, was the only way she might finally be free. From his vantage point on the raised dais, King Alaric watched the ballroom with a gaze that had grown weary of the masquerade. The room was a shimmering tapestry of practiced elegance, where every laugh was timed for maximum impact and every fan fluttered with calculated intent. He saw the young women who threw themselves into his peripheral vision, their movements echoing the same hollow ambition he had witnessed for years. To Alaric, the ball was not a celebration, but a battlefield of performance, and he found himself searching for a single note of honesty in a symphony of practiced deception. His eyes drifted across the sea of glitter and stiff lace, lingering briefly on the clusters of debutantes who stood with their mothers, their faces masked by layers of powder and poise. None of them held his attention for more than a heartbeat. Then, his gaze shifted toward the periphery of the hall, settling on a figure partially obscured by the shadow of a gilded pillar. It was a young woman in a dress of midnight blue velvet, its simplicity cutting a stark, quiet path through the surrounding riot of gold and silk. Unlike the others, who seemed to be auditioning for a role, she appeared to be searching for a way to disappear. Alaric leaned back, his interest piqued by the subtle grace in her stillness. While the rest of the room pulsated with the frantic energy of the hunt, she stood with a composed, almost tragic serenity. He watched as she caught a falling crystal glass from a passing servant's tray before it could shatter, her movements fluid and devoid of the performative flair that defined the rest of the court. There was no seeking of approval, no upward glance toward his throne to see if the king had noticed her intervention. She simply steadied the tray, offered a soft, fleeting nod to the terrified servant, and stepped back into the safety of the dim, quiet corner. The king felt a sudden, sharp clarity pierce through the fog of his apathy. This girl, whose name he did not yet know, was not playing the game of the court. She was an island of genuine motion in a sea of rehearsed static, and for the first time that evening, Alaric felt a pull that had nothing to do with duty. He noted how she tightened her shawl as if to guard herself against the judgmental scrutiny of the crowd, yet she did not retreat in cowardice. She stood her ground with a quiet, hardened dignity. As he watched her, he realized that he was not observing a subject, but a person, one who held herself with a secret, simmering strength that felt more regal than the jewels adorning the women at the center of the floor. He remained still, his curiosity deepening, waiting for the moment he might cross the ballroom to see if she was as authentic as she appeared. The air in the ballroom grew thick with the scent of lilies and the sharp, jagged edge of malice. Cordelia and Octavia had been tracking Elara's movements from across the floor, their eyes narrowing as they realized the king's attention had been tethered to their overlooked sister for far too long. They could not allow the servant of the house to outshine them. With a whispered signal and a predatory slide through the crowd, they cornered Elara near the refreshments, their smiles cold enough to frost the crystal flutes. Cordelia stumbled intentionally, her hand lashing out to snag the delicate midnight blue velvet of Elara's bodice, the thread snapping with a sickening, audible tear that echoed against the sudden, unnatural silence of the nearby courtiers. Octavia let out a gasp that was entirely too loud and entirely too practiced, pointing a gloved finger at the jagged, exposed seam. She laughed, a high, piercing sound meant to draw every eye in the room to the ruin of Elara's dress and the supposed lack of breeding that had brought such a creature into the king's presence. Elara's face paled, her hands flying to her chest to cover the damage, the humiliation burning like acid. She felt the weight of 100 stares, the whispers curling around her like smoke as the court turned to witness her complete social disintegration. She prepared to turn and flee, to dissolve into the shadows of the corridor and never look back when the rhythm of the room suddenly fractured. The heavy, measured footsteps of the king cut through the murmurs, a sound of absolute authority that forced the crowd to part like water before a prow. King Alaric did not look at the sisters. He did not look at the tear in the fabric or the snickering onlookers. His gaze was fixed solely on Elara, his expression unreadable but his stride purposeful and unwavering. As he reached her, the atmosphere shifted from cruel amusement to stunned, breathless awe. Without a word of inquiry or a moment of hesitation, he unclasped his royal mantle, heavy, embroidered, and smelling of cedar and winter, and draped it over Elara's trembling shoulders, effectively shielding the ruin of her gown from the vultures circling her. The silence in the ballroom became absolute, a vacuum where only the heartbeat of the court seemed to pulse. He extended a hand, his fingers steady, offering her a choice that would rewrite the narrative of the entire evening. By crossing that floor, he had not merely rescued a girl, he had declared that the cruelty directed at her was an affront to him, silencing the whispers with a single, devastating gesture of public favor. Elara looked at his hand, then at the sisters whose faces had soured into masks of impotent rage, and realized that for the first time, she was not just being seen, she was being defended by the only man whose opinion truly mattered in this glittering, hollow world. The touch of the king's hand against her own was firm, grounding Elara in a way that defied the frantic pounding of her heart. As he led her onto the center of the ballroom floor, the space seemed to expand, isolating them from the suffocating pressure of the crowd. The orchestra, sensing the shift in the room's gravity, transitioned into a melody that was softer, more deliberate, and unexpectedly intimate. Elara felt the weight of his mantle still draped over her shoulders, a heavy barrier against the icy glares of her sisters, who remained anchored to the sidelines in a state of visible, shuddering disbelief. When they began to move, Elara stumbled slightly, her focus fragmented by the sheer magnitude of the moment. Alaric caught her rhythm with effortless poise, his gaze never once drifting toward the gossiping nobility or the scandalized faces of her family. "You are not merely a guest tonight, Elara," he said, his voice a low, steady anchor beneath the swell of the music. The power dynamic of the room had inverted. The court, which had been poised to laugh at her ruin, now watched with a terrified, newfound reverence. Elara looked up, her trepidation giving way to a quiet, dawning clarity. She realized that by choosing to dance with her, Alaric had not just spared her from humiliation, he had granted her a legitimacy that no dress, however fine, could ever provide. As they turned, the glittering chandeliers caught the silver thread of her gown, and for the first time, Elara did not try to shrink or hide the damage. She matched the king's steady pace, her movements reflecting the grace of someone who had spent her life cultivating beauty in secret, only now daring to display it in the light. Alaric's expression softened, the cold, weary mask he had worn all evening slipping away to reveal a man who was genuinely intrigued by the spirit he had discovered in the shadows. "I have spent years watching performances," he murmured, his eyes searching hers with an intensity that made her breath hitch. "But this is the first time I have seen anything honest." The connection between them hummed in the air, electric and transformative, effectively rewriting the hierarchy of the evening. Her sisters, once the architects of her invisibility, were now rendered irrelevant, their spite swallowed by the crushing realization that their reach had failed. Elara leaned into the dance, her fear dissolving into the music, realizing that she was no longer the girl who had arrived seeking only to disappear. She was the woman who had been chosen, and as the final notes of the song lingered in the air, she knew that the life she had once endured in the silence of the attic was irrevocably over. The music faded, leaving behind a silence that felt heavy with the weight of shattered expectations. As the king escorted Elara back to the edge of the floor, the ballroom seemed to inhale in collective shock. Cordelia and Octavia stood nearby, their faces a frantic study in forced composure, their fingers white-knuckled as they gripped their fans. The air around them crackled with the wreckage of their scheme. They had meant to paint Elara as a pathetic interloper, but the king's mantle draped over her shoulders had transformed her into a figure of unexpected, protected elegance. Octavia was the first to break, stepping forward with a brittle, synthetic laugh that failed to reach her eyes. "Oh, Elara, you clumsy thing," she chirped, her voice dripping with a poisonous, performative concern intended for the king's ears. "You really should have been more careful with your attire. It is such a burden for His Majesty to have to attend to such matters." She glanced toward Alaric, waiting for the flicker of disgust she expected to see, but his expression remained a mask of polite indifference. He did not offer the sisters a single crumb of approval, choosing instead to lean toward Elara, his attention focused entirely on her as if the rest of the room had ceased to exist. The sisters' desperation began to bleed through their polished veneer. Cordelia moved closer, attempting to interject with anecdotes about their family's standing and Elara's frail health and dismal upbringing, but the king silenced them with a single, sharp look that halted their rehearsed justifications mid-sentence. The shift in power was absolute. The courtiers who had been laughing at Elara only minutes before were now drifting toward her, eager to be the first to extend a polite, albeit confused, greeting to the woman the king had deemed worthy of his mantle. Elara watched her sisters crumble in real time, their frantic attempts to save face appearing increasingly hollow against the backdrop of Alaric's unwavering favor. Every time Cordelia tried to reclaim the spotlight, she found herself blocked by the silent, judging presence of the nobility who now prioritized their proximity to Elara. The realization dawned on the sisters that they had miscalculated the one variable they could not control, the king's genuine disdain for their vanity. They were no longer the stars of the evening, but rather the bitter, forgotten remnants of a failed performance. As the king offered Elara a glass of wine with a gentle, private smile, the sisters retreated into the shadows of the pillars, their faces flushed with a stinging realization that their attempt to break Elara had instead provided the very stage upon which she had finally ascended. The terrace was bathed in the cool, silver light of the moon, a stark sanctuary compared to the suffocating heat of the ballroom. Alaric had led her away from the prying eyes of the court, the quiet rustle of the garden leaves providing the first moment of stillness Elara had known in years. She stood near the stone balustrade, still clutching the edges of the king's mantle, as if it were the only thing tethering her to this impossible reality. The thrill of the dance was beginning to give way to the familiar, aching doubt that had been her constant companion since childhood. She looked out over the gardens, her voice barely a whisper. "You did not have to do that," she said, her fingers tightening on the heavy fabric. "Everyone now believes this was some calculated play, that I am merely another woman trying to maneuver for your favor." Alaric stepped closer, his presence commanding yet softened by a sincerity that felt alien in this world of pretense. He looked at her not as a sovereign viewing a subject, but as a man truly seeing the person before him. "I did not cross that room because I was fooled by a performance, Elara," he replied, his tone steady and devoid of the empty platitudes she had expected. "I saw the way you moved, when you thought no one was watching. I saw the kindness you showed to the servant who stumbled, and the quiet dignity with which you bore the malice of your own kin." He reached out, his hand hovering briefly before he gently took the edges of the mantle from her grasp to adjust it, his touch lingering for a heartbeat. "Your sisters tried to expose a flaw, but all they succeeded in doing was revealing their own hollowness," he continued, his eyes searching hers with a penetrating intensity. "You fear that you are unworthy because you have spent your life being told that your value is tied to their approval. But I have spent my reign surrounded by people who hide behind gold and titles to mask their lack of substance. You, however, carry a strength that does not require an audience." Elara felt the defensive walls she had built around her heart begin to tremble. For years, she had believed that being overlooked was her natural state, a consequence of her lack of station. Hearing him articulate the truth, that her resilience was not a weakness, but the very thing that distinguished her, felt like a sudden, profound unburdening. "I have never been seen for who I am," she confessed, her voice thick with suppressed emotion. Alaric offered a small, knowing smile, a look of genuine warmth that bypassed her defenses entirely. "Then let tonight be the end of that," he whispered, the promise hanging in the cool night air like a vow. In that private silence, the insecurity that had defined her existence began to lose its hold, replaced by the terrifying, beautiful realization that she finally had the freedom to be exactly who she was. The dawn arrived not with the familiar, suffocating gray of the attic, but with the soft, gilded light streaming through the windows of the royal guest wing. Elara stood before the vanity, the heavy midnight blue velvet now meticulously restored by the palace seamstresses, who had worked through the night to mirror the intricate, hidden artistry she had once labored over in secret. There was no needle or thread in her hands this morning, only the reflection of a woman who had finally stepped out from the architectural shadows of her sister's ambition. The transformation was not merely in the silk or the silver embroidery, but in the way she held her gaze, steady, unwavering, and entirely her own. News of the events from the night before had already permeated the kingdom, turning the once overlooked Elara Thorne into a figure of intense, whispered fascination. When she walked through the corridors of the palace, the servants who had previously looked through her now bowed with genuine recognition, and the courtiers who had once delighted in her sister's petty cruelties now offered deferential nods of acknowledgement. She was no longer the girl who mended gloves or hid under the weight of her family's debt. She was the woman who had captivated the king not with a performance, but with the quiet, unyielding integrity of her own character. In the late afternoon, Cordelia and Octavia were summoned to the throne room, their faces pale and drawn, stripped of their usual artifice. They looked smaller, less significant, their previous power diminished by the simple fact of Elara's new reality. Elara met them not with the fear of a servant, but with the composed grace of an equal. She did not seek revenge. She did not need to, for she realized that their envy had always been their own prison, and she was no longer bound by its walls. As she stood beside King Alaric, her sisters looked on in hollow, defeated silence, the final remnants of their control over her life dissolving into the cold air of the room. The future lay before her, unmapped and entirely of her own design. She would no longer be the architect of someone else's social standing. She would be the author of her own legacy, a woman defined by her kindness and the quiet, fierce strength that had survived the cruelty of her past. Alaric took her hand, his touch a silent promise of partnership that had nothing to do with duty and everything to do with the truth they had found in the moonlight. Elara turned toward the grand arched doors, leaving the memory of the attic and the dust of domestic servitude behind, stepping into a life where she was finally, irrevocably, free to be seen.